Welcome back to LMJ English. If you're learning English through powerful real-world stories, you're in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video to support our channel and help more people learn English through inspiring global events. Trump and Zelensky meet in a high-stakes effort to end war, but tension leads to uncertainty and an unfinished peace process. Historic meeting in February 2025. The winter sun rose gently over Washington, D.C., casting a soft golden light over the streets as the world held its breath. It was February 2025, and something truly historic was about to unfold behind the tall black gates of the White House. Inside, preparations had been underway for days. The carpets were cleaned, the flags positioned perfectly, and the atmosphere was tense yet full of hope. Leaders had come and gone through these doors before, but this meeting was different. The world was watching because this meeting could mean the beginning of the end of a war. President Donald Trump, now serving his second non-consecutive term, stood tall at the White House entrance. His suit was crisp, his expression unreadable, but behind his composed appearance was the knowledge that today's meeting could shape global politics for years to come. At that moment, the black motorcade approached. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, a former actor turned wartime leader, stepped out of the car. He looked tired. His face carried the shadows of long nights and the weight of a nation, but his posture remained strong. He was here not as a guest, but as a voice for millions of Ukrainians fighting for survival. The handshake was firm and prolonged. Photographers clicked rapidly, trying to capture every angle of the historic moment. Two very different men, shaped by very different pasts, stood shoulder to shoulder. Trump, a businessman and political heavyweight, was known for bold declarations and dramatic turns. Zelensky, once a comedian, had become a symbol of courage and resistance. Despite their differences, both now shared a responsibility larger than themselves: the pursuit of peace in a time of chaos. As they entered the grand halls of the White House, the air seemed heavier. Security guards, advisors, and interpreters followed closely, but none of them spoke. Everyone understood that this moment was more than ceremonial. It was a step toward something bigger, perhaps peace, perhaps failure, but it was movement nonetheless. The two presidents took their seats in the Oval Office. Between them lay not just a wooden desk, but years of tension, hundreds of diplomatic messages, and the cries of a war-torn country. On the walls hung paintings of former leaders who had faced their own crises. Now it was their turn. President Trump leaned forward, clasping his hands together. He welcomed President Zelensky and spoke of unity, strength, and the possibility of rebuilding. His voice was measured yet firm. President Zelensky, speaking with calm precision, thanked Trump for the invitation. He described the unbearable suffering of his people, the destroyed schools and hospitals, the cities reduced to ashes, and the dreams that had died beneath the rubble. He did not come begging for help. He came to remind the world that freedom has a price, and Ukraine was paying it every day. Their discussion was long, careful, and full of complex emotions. They spoke of strategy, support, and sacrifices, but they also spoke of peace, not as a distant idea, but as something that needed to be built, one hard conversation at a time. The historic meeting in February 2025 was not just about a handshake or a photo opportunity. It was about trust being tested, alliances being redefined, and two leaders trying to navigate the storm of war with words instead of weapons. As they stood side by side again for the press, the room filled with questions. But for the first time in a long time, there was also a sliver of hope. Shared goals, but different perspectives. The heavy doors of the Oval Office closed softly behind them, sealing off the outside world for just a moment. Inside, the air was still, the room wrapped in an atmosphere of quiet power and expectation. Two presidents, both carrying the weight of nations, sat face to face. Donald Trump, the leader of one of the most powerful countries on earth, and Volodymyr Zelensky, the defiant voice of a nation fighting for its very existence. Though they had only just met, the tension between them was not one of hostility, but of gravity. They were not enemies, but they were not yet allies in vision, either. They came with the same destination in mind, peace. But the roads they believed would lead there were carved from very different stone. President Trump, leaning slightly forward, gestured with his hands as he spoke. His voice was calm but assertive, the voice of a man who had negotiated across boardrooms and borders for decades. "I believe we can make a deal," he said. "Peace is possible, but peace takes pragmatism. It takes give and take." He spoke of negotiations, of strategies, of working with all sides, including Russia. In his mind, the conflict could be cooled by diplomacy, shaped by economics, and resolved through leverage. He believed in striking a balance between interests, crafting a solution where every party walked away with something, and no one felt completely defeated. President Zelensky listened closely, but his eyes remained serious, unwavering. When he finally spoke, it was with the voice of a man who had stood in bombed-out cities and read letters from children who no longer had homes. "Peace," he said softly, "cannot come at the price of our land, or our people's dignity." For him, the war was not just about politics or territory. It was about identity, about history, about the right of Ukrainians to wake up in their own homes without fear of missile sirens or foreign soldiers. Zelensky did not want a temporary silence. He wanted justice. He wanted safety that would last beyond headlines and election cycles. He wanted peace, but not if it meant surrendering Ukraine's soul. The contrast in their perspectives became clearer with every word. Trump believed in fast action, in high-impact diplomacy, in results. Zelensky believed in the long game, in integrity and standing firm even when the world seemed to shake around him. Still, despite these differences, something unexpected began to grow between them, an understanding, not of agreement, but of recognition. Trump began to see in Zelensky not just a political figure, but a man who had been shaped by war, by real pain, by the desperate prayers of a nation under siege. And Zelensky, in turn, began to recognize Trump's desire to be a peacemaker, perhaps driven by ambition, but also by a real belief that deals can change destinies. Their conversation moved slowly, like a river cutting through rock. At times it was smooth and cooperative. At other moments it hit sharp edges, painful truths. They talked about Russia, about NATO, about diplomacy and defense. Every topic revealed the same thing. They wanted the same end, an end to war, but their means would require compromise, trust, and time. As the meeting ended and the staff re-entered the room, the two presidents stood up. They had not yet found answers, but they had found something almost as rare, an honest dialogue. In a world full of noise, they had taken the time to truly listen. And though their perspectives were different, they now walked side by side toward whatever came next, discussions on war and peace. As the day unfolded within the stately walls of the White House, time seemed to slow. The sound of distant footsteps in marble corridors, the rustle of papers, the soft clicking of pens, all faded into the background. In the heart of it all, in the quiet space between strategy and humanity, two presidents sat in deep discussion. They were no longer simply representatives of countries. In that moment, they were two men facing the terrifying complexity of war and the fragile possibility of peace. President Volodymyr Zelensky had spent countless days at the front lines of pain. He carried with him the stories of a wounded nation, of mothers who buried sons too soon, of fathers who returned to villages reduced to dust, of children whose only lullaby was the sound of sirens. He spoke with quiet intensity, his voice steady, but heavy with sorrow. Peace, he said, is not just the silence of guns. It is the return of life, the rebuilding of schools, the reopening of markets, the laughter of children playing without fear. President Donald Trump leaned back in his chair, listening intently. Despite his trademark confidence and often forceful demeanor, he seemed momentarily still, absorbing not just the words but the pain within them. "We've fought hard wars," he said at last. "We've paid prices. But this is something the world needs to end. Not tomorrow, not in 10 years. Now." Their dialogue shifted between the practical and the personal. Trump asked hard questions. How could peace be enforced if one side refused to stop? How could the U.S. help without being drawn into a deeper conflict? Was there a real solution, or just a temporary calm before another storm? Zelensky answered with stories, not just numbers. He told of a young medic named Katerina, who volunteered near Kherson, risking her life every day to carry wounded civilians to safety. He described a teenage boy who had kept a journal under candlelight in a basement shelter, writing, "I want to grow up in peace." These were not political symbols, these were lives. They discussed potential ceasefires, international observers, sanctions, and the complex path to post-war reconstruction. Trump floated ideas that included diplomatic pressure, increased humanitarian aid, and economic incentives to bring all sides to the table. "We need bold moves," he said. "Smart deals, strong voices. That's how peace is made." But Zelensky pushed back gently but firmly. "Peace cannot come from pressure alone," he said. "It must be born from justice. If we build it on broken promises, it will collapse again." Hours passed. At times they disagreed. Trump, ever the negotiator, eager to find leverage. Zelensky, the defender of a bleeding homeland, unwilling to sacrifice dignity for diplomacy. And yet within those disagreements was something rare in politics: sincerity. Both men wanted the war to end. Both men knew that every day without peace meant more funerals, more refugee camps, more pain that might never be healed. But their definitions of peace came from different places. For Trump, peace was an outcome, a strategic victory. For Zelensky, peace was sacred. It had to feel like justice, or it wasn't peace at all. As evening shadows stretched across the Oval Office, both men stood, exhausted but respectful. No documents had been signed, no breakthroughs declared. But something real had happened. They had spoken from the heart, not the script. In that room, beneath the gaze of history, they had begun a conversation that reached beyond politics and into the soul of war itself. They knew the road ahead would be long, uncertain, and often painful, but at least now they were walking it with their eyes open, and maybe, just maybe, toward the same light. Negotiating an agreement. The following days in Washington unfolded like a delicate dance, carefully choreographed yet tense with unspoken stakes. Behind closed doors, far from the flashing cameras and formal handshakes, real work had begun. The American and Ukrainian delegations, suits sharp, expressions sharper, gathered in long meeting rooms lined with American flags and maps. They came with documents, data, and deep intentions. But underneath all of that lay something far more powerful, the urgency to find an agreement that could change the course of a brutal war. President Trump's team moved quickly, bringing forward proposals built on strategy and opportunity. They outlined a vision that promised not only to support Ukraine militarily, but also to invest in its future. The United States, Trump emphasized, was prepared to help, but help came with expectations. "We're talking about partnership," he told reporters earlier that morning. "It has to make sense for both sides. We want peace, but also progress." For President Zelensky and his team, the pressure was immense. Every hour spent in negotiation rooms was an hour away from Kyiv, away from the chaos and courage of a country under siege. Yet Zelensky knew that diplomacy was as much a battlefield as any front line, and perhaps in the long run, even more important. His message was clear. Ukraine needed security, real and unwavering. Promises on paper were not enough. They had seen promises broken before. One of the core issues on the table was security guarantees. Ukraine wanted strong, binding commitments, military aid, weapons, training, and intelligence support. Zelensky's foreign minister stood firm. "We are not asking to be saved. We are asking to stand beside you as partners, as equals. Help us defend ourselves, and we will do the rest." Another topic pulsed with economic and political weight: Ukraine's rare earth minerals. Beneath its soil lay valuable resources used in everything from smartphones to electric cars. The U.S. expressed strong interest in building long-term cooperation on mining and technology. Trump saw opportunity. Securing these resources would help reduce American dependence on other foreign powers and create new jobs and markets. Zelensky, too, saw value, but not if it came at the cost of national control. "We will share," he said, "but not surrender." Hours turned into days. Discussions turned into debates. Lawyers reviewed drafts. Interpreters whispered translations. Across tense tables, there were moments of optimism. Smiles, nods, coffee shared late into the night. And there were moments when everything nearly fell apart, raised voices, slammed folders, and calls back home for guidance. Perhaps the most difficult topic was Russia. Trump believed there might be room to engage with Moscow, perhaps to pull them into a wider negotiation. Zelensky was wary, almost weary of the suggestion. "You cannot reason with someone who bombs your cities while speaking of peace," he said. "We are not naive." Back and forth the talks went. There was progress, yes, but never certainty. The outlines of an agreement began to form: military support, economic cooperation, post-war rebuilding plans, and a shared vision of peace. Yet every word mattered. Every phrase carried meaning, and neither side was willing to be misunderstood. By the third evening, everyone looked tired. Suits were looser, ties removed. The conversations became more personal. Trump shared memories of Cold War fears. Zelensky spoke of his grandfather, who had fought against fascism, and of the bitter irony that now his own generation was fighting again for the right to exist. And in that moment, amid the fatigue, the fire of ideals, and the cold strategy of realpolitik, they remembered why they were here. They were not just negotiating an agreement. They were trying to stop a war, and that, more than anything else, made every word worth fighting for. Russia's role. The name they had tried to dance around in earlier meetings could no longer be avoided. Russia. It was the shadow that hung over every conversation, the third presence in every room, even when no Russian official was invited. The war had started with Russia, and now any path to peace would have to pass through it. President Trump was the first to address it openly in one of the closed-door sessions. "We're not going to end this without talking to Moscow," he said plainly. "Whether we like it or not, Russia's fingerprints are all over this war. You don't get peace without pulling Putin into the conversation." He was right in one sense. Vladimir Putin remained the immovable figure on the other side of the battlefield, calculating, commanding, and still holding vast power over Ukraine's eastern borders. Trump believed in the art of the deal, and to him, a deal without all players at the table was no deal at all. He picked up the phone. Quietly, without press announcements or official statements, he initiated a line of communication. It was cautious, it was tense, but it was real. President Zelensky, however, was not so quick to embrace this move. When he heard that Trump had spoken to Putin, his expression changed. Behind his composed demeanor was a storm of emotion, disappointment, fear, maybe even anger. "You can talk to him," Zelensky said during a late-night briefing, "but do not forget who he is. We do not sit at the table with the one who burns our homes and calls it politics." For Zelensky, Russia was not just a geopolitical actor. It was the force that had invaded his country, annexed Crimea, bombed cities, and sent millions of his people fleeing into the unknown. His trust had been broken long ago. "They do not want peace," he said. "They want submission, and we are not theirs to submit." Still, Trump insisted there might be another way. He proposed a multilateral dialogue, one that could bring Russia, Ukraine, and key international allies into the same conversation. "Sometimes," he said, "you make peace not because you trust the other side, but because the cost of not talking is too high." The divide between the two leaders deepened, but so did their mutual understanding of what was at stake. They were both trying to prevent the same disaster, but their methods clashed like thunder against stone. Trump believed in pressure, in economic levers, in private diplomacy. Zelensky believed in moral clarity, in defense, and in drawing red lines that must never be crossed. There was one thing Zelensky made unmistakably clear. Ukraine would not trade land for peace. Not Crimea, not Donbass, not 1 inch. "You can't negotiate with a knife still at your throat," he said, "and you cannot sign peace on top of a stolen map." This was the hardest truth of all, because while Trump believed that deals required concessions, Zelensky saw any concession as a betrayal, not just to his people, but to history. Despite their differences, both men agreed on one vital point. If there was to be peace, it must come with strength, not weakness, and it must come with vigilance, not naivety. Russia's role would not be ignored, but neither would Ukraine's right to exist, whole and free. As they left the meeting room that night, neither man spoke for several minutes. Why? Silence was not cold. It was thoughtful, heavy. Each of them knew the next steps would be harder still, because talking to Russia wasn't just about negotiation. It was about memory, pain, justice, and deciding what kind of peace was worth having. Business and resources. Outside, a light snow had begun to fall over Washington, blanketing the streets in white. But inside the negotiation rooms, the air was anything but calm. The talks had moved from war and weapons to something less visible, but just as powerful: business and resources. Beneath every battlefield was another battle, one of economics, energy, and opportunity. President Trump saw this moment as more than a chance to stop a war. He saw a window to reshape the future. "Peace isn't just about stopping bullets," he said during a strategy meeting. "It's about building something better, and that means business." His team brought forward bold proposals. The United States was ready to invest, not only in post-war reconstruction, but also in Ukraine's natural wealth. Ukraine, it turned out, was sitting on one of the world's most coveted treasures: rare earth minerals. These were the invisible keys to the modern world, essential for smartphones, electric cars, advanced military systems, and green energy technologies. Trump wanted in. For Ukraine, the offer was tempting but complicated. President Zelensky knew his country needed help. The war had devastated roads, power plants, factories, entire towns. Rebuilding would cost billions. Investment from the US could mean new jobs, modern infrastructure, and a future built not just on recovery but on renewal. But Zelensky also knew the risks. Too often, countries in crisis had handed over control of their resources to foreign powers, only to be left behind when the profits dried up. "We will share," he said in one economic roundtable, "but we will not be owned. Our minerals are not for sale. They are part of our future." Another key area of discussion was energy. Ukraine wanted to expand its liquefied natural gas, LNG capabilities, hoping to become a regional hub. The US, under Trump's leadership, saw an opportunity to support this plan, with American companies playing a major role. LNG plants, pipelines, and storage facilities could reshape the region's energy map and reduce dependence on Russian gas. "Energy is security," Trump said. "We help Ukraine become energy strong, and we all get stronger." The two leaders also explored new defense partnerships: high-tech weapons, drone systems, cyber protection. Ukraine was eager to modernize its military, and the US had the tools. In exchange, Ukraine offered access to its own military innovations, including advanced drone technology developed during the war. These weren't just machines. They were proof of resilience. It was a trade of strengths. One nation had resources, the other had capital and industry. Together they could build something powerful. But it wasn't without tension. Trump wanted quick deals. He was used to signing contracts and watching projects rise from blueprints to skyscrapers. Zelensky wanted safeguards, transparency, fairness. His people had already sacrificed too much to rebuild their country, just to lose it again in contracts written in small print. There were moments when voices rose, when numbers were debated, when conditions were questioned. But there were also moments of inspiration. Ukrainian engineers spoke with American tech developers about rebuilding smart cities. Farmers from Lviv envisioned exporting to global markets again. Women entrepreneurs from Kyiv proposed business grants for war widows looking to start small businesses. These were not just dreams. They were plans waiting for peace. As the talks stretched into the night, one truth became clear: war destroys, but business rebuilds. The question wasn't whether to cooperate, it was how to do so without repeating the mistakes of the past. Trump saw economic opportunity. Zelensky saw national rebirth, and somewhere in between a new chapter of Ukraine's story began to take shape. not just of survival, but of strength, sovereignty, and shared success. The breaking point. The press room inside the White House was filled to the brim. Rows of reporters sat shoulder to shoulder, notebooks open, cameras aimed, ready for what was expected to be a routine joint press conference. But the atmosphere was anything but routine. There was a hum of tension in the air, the kind that comes before a storm. Everyone sensed it, though no one could explain exactly why. President Donald Trump entered first, flanked by advisers. His expression was composed but stern. Just moments later, President Volodymyr Zelensky stepped in. His face was harder to read, calm but clouded with something unspoken. The two leaders took their places at the podiums. The world leaned in. Trump spoke first. He began by highlighting the progress made during the visit: military support discussions, energy cooperation, investment plans. But then his tone changed. A slight pause, a shift in his posture, and the words came out sharper than expected. "We've done a lot for Ukraine," he said, his voice steady but colder. "A lot more than any country has ever done, and frankly, we're not sure we've seen enough appreciation." The room froze. Cameras clicked faster. Reporters exchanged glances. Zelensky turned his head slightly toward Trump, eyebrows raised as if wondering whether he'd heard correctly. And then, slowly but firmly, he stepped up to speak. "Ukraine is thankful," Zelensky began, his voice controlled. "We have always been thankful, but this is not just about gratitude, this is about survival." He paused, looked directly at the crowd and then back to Trump. "We are fighting for our land, for our people. Every day we lose lives, not just soldiers but civilians, families. This is not charity. This is a fight for freedom, and freedom deserves respect, not a receipt." His words struck the air like a bell, clear, defiant, unapologetic. Behind them, Vice President J.D. Vance leaned in toward Trump and whispered something too quiet to catch. Trump didn't respond. Instead, he leaned forward toward the microphone again. "Thanks is important, Mr. President," he said, his voice more pointed now. "Respect is earned. And this isn't just a humanitarian issue. It's a business of global stability, and it needs accountability." Zelensky didn't flinch. "Respect," he replied, "is mutual, and so is sacrifice. Ukraine has not asked for anything we wouldn't give ourselves if roles were reversed. We are not bargaining chips. We are a nation." The silence afterward was louder than the speeches. Everyone in the room felt it. The crack in the wall of diplomacy. Not a collapse, but a fracture. A shift. A sharp reminder that even allies, even well-intentioned leaders, can clash when hearts lead them in different directions. Vice President Vance stepped forward. His tone was professional, but there was tension in every syllable. "Perhaps it fares best if we pause the press conference for today," he announced. "These conversations are complex. They deserve more space than a stage can offer." President Trump nodded, his jaw tight. He stepped away from the podium without another word. Zelensky hesitated for a moment, then followed. The sound of hurried typing and whispered questions filled the room as the doors slowly closed behind them. In the hallway outside, advisers looked at each other, uncertain. The press conference, intended to be a sign of unity, had instead revealed the fragile line between alliance and disagreement. The hope that had filled the first days of meetings now sat quietly in the shadows, waiting to see if it would rise again. For both leaders, this moment would be remembered, not for the policies discussed, but for the emotion unleashed, for the lines drawn, for the truth that diplomacy is not only about agreements, it's also about identity, dignity, and how far each side is willing to bend before something breaks. And in that room, something had broken. What happens next? The corridors of the White House had fallen quiet. The press had dispersed, the lights had dimmed, and the energy that once buzzed with potential now felt heavy, like the end of a play where the audience is unsure whether to clap or cry. Behind the silence was a single, unsettling question. What happens next? President Zelensky left Washington the following morning. He did not give another press statement. There were no final waves, no last-minute sound bites, just a quiet ride to the airport, a quick farewell to the American officials who had accompanied him, and then the jet lifted into the cold morning sky, its path eastward, back to a country still under fire. In a short statement released by his office, Zelensky thanked the American people for their warmth and hospitality. But between the lines, the disappointment was clear. His mission had started with great hope for solid agreements, long-term support, and a united front. But it had ended in confusion, tension, and a widening gap between need and understanding. President Trump, meanwhile, returned to his schedule. In a press briefing, he spoke firmly. "Peace is a process," he said. "Sometimes people aren't ready for it. That's okay, we'll keep working. But peace takes more than speeches, it takes readiness." It was a subtle shift, a redirection of responsibility. To Trump's supporters, it was a pragmatic move, a leader protecting national interests. To his critics, it was a missed opportunity for global leadership in a moment that demanded more than politics. In Kyiv, the mood was mixed. Some praised Zelensky for standing firm, for not giving in to pressure or demands for compromise that felt too costly. Others feared what the failure of talks might mean. Would the weapons continue to arrive? Would the funding stall? Had Ukraine just walked away from its best chance at securing peace or protecting itself? The unfinished agreement now sat in limbo. Drafts remained unsigned. Economic plans were shelved. The dialogue was paused, not dead, but wounded. No one declared the relationship broken, but no one could pretend it was unchanged. Other countries took notice. Leaders across Europe watched carefully. Some reached out quietly to both Washington and Kyiv, hoping to serve as bridges or brokers. China issued a neutral statement calling for dialogue and balance. NATO emphasized its continued support for Ukraine. But behind the scenes, questions swirled. Would the US and Ukraine continue as partners, or had something shifted forever? In living rooms across the world, people discussed the meeting not in terms of trade or military statistics, but as a human story. Two men trying to lead in an age of chaos. Two nations navigating the fine line between partnership and pride. People wondered if the break had been inevitable, or if, just maybe, with different words, at a different moment, the ending could have been different. Still, hope, fragile as it was, had not completely vanished. Zelensky returned to Ukraine not with a deal, but with his dignity intact. He remained a symbol of resilience to his people. And Trump, despite the friction, left the door open. "We'll see," he said when asked if talks would resume. Things change, people change, and history keeps moving. And so the world waits for a phone call, a new invitation, a quieter conversation away from cameras, waits for leadership that listens and action that builds rather than breaks. Waits for peace, not the easy kind written on paper, but the lasting kind written in courage, respect, and truth. The next steps are uncertain, but in this uncertain world, sometimes even the smallest gesture can become the beginning of something greater. If you found this story valuable, please like, share, comment, and subscribe to support LMJ English. Your support helps us bring more thoughtful, meaningful, and inspiring stories to English learners around the world. Below are 20 key vocabulary words or phrases that were used repeatedly throughout the full story, along with clear explanations in English to help with learning and understanding. Diplomacy. The process of managing international relations and negotiations between countries, often through dialogue and peaceful means rather than conflict. Alliance. A formal agreement or partnership between countries or leaders to support one another, especially during times of war or political tension. Ceasefire. A temporary or permanent stop to fighting between two or more sides in a conflict, often to allow for peace talks. Sovereignty. The full right and power of a country to govern itself without outside interference. Negotiation. A discussion aimed at reaching an agreement between two or more parties, often involving compromise and strategic decision-making. Reconstruction. The process of rebuilding and restoring a country or region after it has been damaged, especially by war. Support. Help or assistance given by one country or leader to another, often in the form of military aid, financial resources, or political backing. Agreement. A formal decision or deal made between two parties after discussion, outlining terms that both sides accept. Security. The condition of being protected from harm or danger, often used in discussions about national defense or safety from threats. Resources. Natural materials or assets that can be used for economic or strategic purposes, such as minerals, energy, or land. Tension. A state of mental or emotional strain or conflict between groups or individuals that has not yet led to open confrontation. War. An active conflict between two or more nations or groups, usually involving armed forces and major destruction. Peace. A state of harmony and the absence of war, violence, or conflict between or within nations. Respect. The act of showing consideration or value for someone's rights, dignity or achievements, trust, confidence in the honesty, reliability, or intentions of another person or nation. Investment. The act of putting money, time, or resources into a project or partnership with the hope of getting benefits in the future. Freedom. The right of people or nations to act, speak, or live without being controlled or oppressed. Deal. A negotiated arrangement or agreement, especially in business or politics. Crisis. A time of intense difficulty, danger, or uncertainty, often requiring immediate and decisive action. Partnership. A relationship between individuals, organizations, or nations working together toward shared goals or interests.